Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to Radio LUMS. My name is Mustafa Khan, and the show for today is Providence. On Providence, we discuss questions related to the future of humanity. And for today, our topic is the technology and the environment. Our very special guest for today is SSC's own Dr. Shahana Khurshid. Dr. Shahana, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mustafa.
Dr. Shahana's research interests include air pollution and particle science, and she teaches these at LUMS too. So, Dr. Shahana, for today, we'll be discussing what are the different technologies that we can or must use to help prevent the worst effects of climate change, while also discussing in more specific detail your research specialization in air pollution. So, just for starters, would you like to give our listeners sort of overview of the state of the environment today related to global warming and all the other climate crisis issues we're facing?
Thank you for having me, Mustafa. And that's quite a overarching question to begin with. Let's break these up a little bit into the issue of global warming, and then one of the contributing factors to global warming is air pollution. So we'll come to that then. If we consider global warming, the most classic sort of image that goes with any analysis of global warming are the carbon dioxide concentrations that have existed for millions of years, in the thousands of years actually. We did go through an ice age. So historically, we've had carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere that have been around 260 parts per million. And we've stayed at that for thousands of years. And then we jump ahead to the industrial era and our discovery of fossil fuels and automation and industrial processes, giving us things that we could never imagine before. I mean, my son was so astounded that we didn't have electricity prior to 150, 200 years back. And he was just amazed, like, how can there be no electricity? What did people do? They use candles. It's fine. People can exist. But all those perks have literally have been a double-edged sword, because we have become so used to having electricity with light, with fan, but now with ACs, air conditioners, and, similarly, the concept of there were no fridges past, 100 years back. How would we prevent food from spoiling? But we've gotten so used to those. So even I would think refrigerators would be an important necessity. But air conditioning, I'd wonder, especially in the room that we're sitting in right now, even the air conditioning is at a level which is probably higher than I would be comfortable at. So we're wasting a lot of this energy. We are not using energy efficient ways of generating power. We are not using well insulated buildings to seal in the conditioned air that we're supplying to our buildings. So there are definitely ways of using less energy to provide thermal comfort. But all of these, and it's from a consumer level, going up to an industrial processes level, where we are manufacturing products, and the amount of energy that industry is using is just so much that with fossil fuel combustion providing energy to fuel these processes. So jumping ahead to the industrial era, and now we have gone from 260 around parts per million of carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere to over 420 parts per million. It's a huge increase, which has never been, could never have been imagined. Industrial processes accounts for about 40% of global carbon dioxide emissions every year. Transportation contributes about 20% to the total carbon dioxide emissions every year, followed by building operations, which is about 30%. So when I'm talking about, we as a consumer, we contribute. That's the building operations. That's our transportation. All our vehicles, the cars that we use to transport ourselves to LUMS, back to offices and back home. All of that is contributing to carbon dioxide emissions. And here we're not even talking about air quality. We're just talking about carbon dioxide emissions. Obviously, there are stronger global warming gases, chlorofluorocarbons, and other gases which have higher global warming potential. But so from a consumer point of view and going up to industrial processes where 40% of the emissions are coming from industrial sources, there is really so much that can be done, that should be done, because so far we have released 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that has led to the increase from 260 to 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide. How much more can we safely release if we want to stay within 2 centigrade of our Earth's temperature going up? We can only safely release about 330 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So that's really, at the rate that we are going, we will break our carbon budget in 8 years. So, which is why there is so much awareness and talk of, reducing carbon emissions, reducing our carbon emissions. How much do we need? How quickly do we need to go to zero emissions for our carbon budget? Even if we go down to zero emissions by 2040, we will still emit 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide between now and 2040. But that will keep us at a 67% probability of meeting the 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in temperature. So these are all different models that we have to sort of, how quickly do we need to do what to protect, to keep the temperatures at levels that we have seen and that the Earth is comfortable at being maintained. But even if you don't set a target for 2040, just consider that every year 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide are added to the atmosphere every year. So just whatever we can do to reduce that, whether we keep 2040 as the zero emissions target, or something earlier than that. But linking it on to how all these emissions are exacerbating our air pollution, we are now going to be entering smog season in Lahore. And every year, there's this sort of concern which ramps up in the winter months and then completely dies down through the year. Or at least there's some awareness, but not as much. And some is done. I mean, I saw in the newspapers a few days back that the Punjab provincial government has implemented the section of the constitution which bans crop residue burning. So that is definitely one of the key factors which exacerbates air pollution. But I'll go back to our car scenario of motor vehicles being driven to LUMS and back home and to schools and back. That contributes, in some studies, about 40% or half of the mass of particles being emitted in Lahore. So specifically talking about Lahore, source apportionment studies have found that vehicles contribute around 50% of the mass of PM 2.5 particles. So PM 2.5 are just particles which are smaller than 2.5 micrometers in diameter. We talk about, you may have heard of PM 2.5. It's the particle size that's most health relevant because it is small enough to go through the upper airways, down through the trachea, into the bronchi, further into the alveoli. And alveoli is where the actual gas exchange is taking place. So if you have these tiny particles in the place where you're exchanging oxygen, passing oxygen into the blood and getting carbon dioxide from the blood, obviously with the presence of these small particles, any toxic chemicals, species, metals, volatile organic compounds, all of those have the probability of being passed into the bloodstream and can have downstream health effects on various organs in the body. So we don't even fully understand all the effects of PM 2.5. So that's the size range of particle that we are most concerned about from a health point of view. So it really matters that the vehicles that we drive emit particles and emit gas phase species which can react with each other to condense into particles, which are that small that then have these health effects and lead to the accumulation in the surface layer of the atmosphere. Why specifically in Lahore? I mean, cars are all over Pakistan, but in Lahore specifically because of the temperature inversion layer during the winter months, where you essentially have cold air trapped next to the ground with a warm air layer above it. That warm air layer effectively traps in all the pollutants underneath being emitted. And so that leads to basically sort of a ceiling effect. You've just put a lid on top of all your power plant emissions, your vehicle emissions, anything blown up by dust as well, by wind, but everything else, your gas phase emissions reacting. So it's just this concentrated milieu of gas phase pollutants and particle phase pollutants, which are just reacting and, have nuclei, act as nuclei to form further particle formation. So it's really, if we reduce our carbon emission, we will obviously be reducing our emissions from power plants and motor vehicles. So that really is key for us to move forward towards reducing global warming, towards improving air quality.
So here in Lahore, we're really stewing in the sort of worst things in the winter.
That and I was surprised, and I knew that it was bad enough, but I was on a panel recently, and that made me check up the worst polluted cities in the world. And last year, in fact, Lahore on several days apparently was the worst polluted city in the world.
Yes.
And one has always thought of Los Angeles and Beijing and other cities, but we are really at the top of the list. Not every day, but on our worst days during smog season, we were above, have worse air quality than New Delhi and Beijing even.
Yeah, that's it's really something to think about. What things we've done to change that, which isn't much, like you're saying. But like you mentioned, a lot of things about the things human beings have been doing over the past few hundred years. A lot of those things are now considered, at least to some extent, irreversible. Like, even if, like you're saying, we slow down our carbon emissions, try and get to zero by 2040, we're still doomed to an increase in global temperatures of at least 1.5 degrees centigrade. And, you open social media, you open any sort of news forum, and you're just inundated with information about, all the bad things that are already here. Like, scientists have, I think, found that rainwater in any place on Earth now is not safe for consumption, because of the sheer amount of, like air pollution, water pollutants, and microplastics have been found in bloodstreams all over the world. But you open social media and you also find, this plethora of technology, of solutions that are there, that have been shown to work, that have, potential for helping us at least curb, if not reversing is difficult, but at least curb the worst effects. Why do you think, even though they're there and everyone knows about these things, why do you think we're failing to implement such technology? What are the different sort of, constraints on us? Are they simply because we can't afford them? Is it a question of choice? In your personal experience, what have you seen?
That's a question which has both the scientific and the societal aspects to it, right? So let's begin with the societal ones. When you're considering people who have been using a particular technology for years, for decades, so consider brick kilns, for example. Typically, low quality fuel is used to provide the energy to bake the bricks, which leads to several harmful pollutants, particles, other gas phase species. Even tires can be burnt, whatever, coal. But now you go in and step in and say that I will want you to incorporate the zigzag element to the chimney so that your emissions get reduced. And I want you to implement this. Somebody pointed this out last week, that they were given a fairly short amount of time to incorporate this technology. As the brick kiln owner, where will the resources come from? That mental shift as well. You've used something for decades in a particular way, and now suddenly you're being asked to make the switch all of a sudden. I guess the challenge from the government's point of view is that they need to make these changes now, because it's already, in the middle of smog season, or based on the fact that last year it was so bad, so now they have to implement it ASAP. But so it's difficult to have people change their behavioral patterns very quickly, and especially if it's not this climate issue. Even if there is smog that you can't see the end of the street, even then, I can rattle off numbers that, there are 7 million premature deaths every year due to air pollution. But to the layman, how does he know that air pollution was what caused that premature death? It could have been just the sheer act of God. It could have been just some other disease. That some other disease is linked. That 7 million is not just coming out of nowhere. These are World Health Organization estimates based on correlations between air pollution and mortality rates in different regions. So, and there in some cases causative sort of linkages between exposure to particulate pollution and these diseases. But to the layman, it's a very amorphous concept. Air pollution causing death, yeah, whatever. So people aren't necessarily going to be that quick to adapt to changes which are not so clear, so explicit. And climate change is even more amorphous than that, right? Because that's something which, flooding caused due to changing climate patterns, changing weather patterns, is just again, there are many factors which contribute to it. In many cases, these emissions are happening in countries far, far away. Pakistan's contribution to the carbon budget is not as much, but Pakistan's contribution to air pollution is significant. But so these are not as clear to the public. General education improving and awareness will help. And that cannot just be targeted for this specifically. In general, if you educate the masses, then there will be a growing understanding of these various issues. But so on a societal level, that's the issue. And on a scientific, when you have big industries already functioning and using the fossil fuels and as an energy source, switching to greener technology, switching to renewable sources of energy will require initial high infrastructural costs. If you move to wind power, you do first have to set up the windmills, and the funding for that has to come from somewhere. If you already have a channel built for fossil fuel being supplied to you, you will have to put in that extra effort, resources to switch. And not all industry and many wouldn't want to. Unless there are financial incentives or tax repercussions. And I've been told that while the law exists in Pakistan to improve, to protect the environment, the sheer fact is that the implementation of these laws is not there. It's hard in a country where there is issues with law and order on other heads, to bring about changes in what technology is used and in the use of green technology and the use of renewable energy. These are of lesser concern almost than when there's just shortage of basic necessities in many cases. So on both heads, science is providing us the solutions, but more can be done to provide solutions which are more economically feasible. But there is continued work on that. But I think to make it more feasible to adapt will have to come through the use of financial incentives. Otherwise, nobody will want to willingly go towards something which is unknown or hasn't been used.
And I think it's very right that you've mentioned that a lot of it just comes from this asymmetry of information and perspective between, students, researchers, policymakers, and governments, and the layman, for many of whom climate change seems to be a very abstract, removed idea, but it affects their lives in many different ways, as we're seeing in Pakistan right now, especially. Climate change often affects us in ways that are not immediately obvious. For example, the floods right now in Pakistan. Researchers and policymakers have drawn conclusions that show that these floods are far worse than floods in the past because of human activity having caused climate change that have changed weather patterns. But people don't see it exactly like that at first glance. So there is a need to increase awareness. So, Dr. Shahana, coming back to you, given all the research you've done on air pollution, in Pakistan, given that you're living in Lahore itself, what personally have you done to sort of, insulate yourself from the worst effects of climate change, and on the other side, reduce your carbon footprint if you have made any changes?
Thanks for that, Mustafa. We are all living in our consumer world. So all of us have, in fact, the ones who are have the biggest carbon footprint are the ones who are protecting ourselves probably the most from it, because we can buy things like standalone filters and put it in our room to purify the air inside our room. But I haven't done that per se, because I believe in fresh air. My research has actually been on indoor air quality. So, and a lot of this research was done in the US, where they've basically cleaned up the air outside their homes, and now they're focusing on indoor air. For us, indoor air quality is also definitely a matter of concern, because we bring in, with our scenting agents and our furniture and our paint, we have high emissions indoors, which then reacts with the ozone coming in from outdoors. And we have cooking and, gas stoves and candles burning and all that. So we were bringing in outdoor air pollution, and then we have all these indoor sources as well. So it's definitely a matter for concern for us. But we first need to tackle our outdoor air pollution, I would say. Prioritization needs to happen. But in the US, they live in boxes, so really it's more of a concern, because whatever you emit indoors, you're then breathing for the next several hours. So your exposure duration is that much higher. And so that's why I believe in fresh air, because I want to protect myself from all the indoor emissions. But in terms of reducing our carbon footprint, I am a firm believer in in reuse whenever possible. My kids are to the point of being, irritating to them sometimes, probably. If you get a plastic spoon from somewhere, you can reuse it. If it's really gone bad, then eventually do you need to throw it. The single-use concept of plastics is the biggest contributor to plastics increasing in the environment. And you would say, but how does that link to air pollution? Anything that you use that has been manufactured uses energy, has been made in industry using fossil fuels, burning to provide the energy to mold that plastic into that form, which I'm then using. So the more that I use and throw, the more that I need. So from an economics point of view, demand, if the demand increases, economies will stronger. But from an environmentalist point of view, since I'm an environmental engineer, I want Pakistan to grow and become strong, but I don't want to throw off my plastic spoon to help that. So that would be reusing wherever we can, to reuse, to carpool together. There's some, again, another panel, some folks were discussing, how schools may be willing to offer bus transport to their students, but parents are not. So I'm talking about people who are like you and me, who are, who live in there, like, no, my kid will go in my car, individual car to school and back. My kids go to a school where the line outside takes half an hour, at least 15 minutes. And it's just, the car is just idling along in that line, slowly inching forward. The emissions, so, a car vehicle exhausts emit nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, because of additives in the fuel and other noxious gases. But even at the low speeds and at high speeds, the emissions are higher. So if your car is idling along, it's worse. The emissions are worse than if it was driving smoothly at 40 miles per hour. So I would really want to have a system where the schools would offer a bus system. The bus network is currently, just because of the low demand, it's not wide enough that if I would in any case have to drive 10 minutes to go pick up my child. So that's why I haven't opted for that. But I wish there would be, the mass transit and these carpool options. These kinds of things are what are needed so that we can reduce the emissions from our vehicles. I was mentioning the studies earlier on, which have looked at where particles in Lahore are coming from, and 2/3 of the emissions are due to carbonaceous carbon emissions. So that's, coming from diesel emissions, that's coming from vehicles, that's what we can do, and a lot of these emissions were from non-catalyzed motor vehicles. So the 50% of contribution was from non-catalyzed motor vehicles, 50% contribution to PM 2.5 mass in Lahore. All that needs is a catalytic converter. The catalytic converter will remove will reduce the percentage of harmful substances in the exhaust fumes, will reduce the carbon monoxide, will reduce the nitrogen oxides, the hydrocarbons. So that's straightforward enough to implement for all of us. But personally, I don't even know if how good the catalytic converter in my vehicle works. So that kind of, if it's driven by the government in terms of if that is mandated by that every year emissions from vehicles have to meet a certain criteria in order to pass registration, those kinds of things would really sort of help us implement it on a wider scale. On a wider scale, moving towards renewable energy wherever possible. So there is initiatives being taken in Punjab for electric vehicles, so 2-wheel, 3-wheeler electric vehicles. And that is really a step in the right direction, because amount of motorcycles, we're all irritated by the number of motorbikes on the road with their emissions, and you can visibly see exhaust fumes from many of these vehicles. And in some cases, even if you don't, that's the sort of key behind air pollution, right? That even the gas phase species, which you can't see, they react together and nucleate into these tiny particles, which then grow in size and then get transported across distances and are add to the smog, add to the health effects due to the smog. So these electric vehicles are a way to move forward, and we haven't really fully explored or adopted other renewable sources of energy, but wherever possible, wind energy, solar energy, there's this sort of initiative being taken by several residences now have solar panels on them, and wherever that can be encouraged, because that's where we can reduce the demand of power plants running fossil fuel and move that towards sources of energy which are totally renewable and will not create that carbon footprint.
All right, that's great, Dr. Shahana. Thank you for mentioning these points. And I think in our own country right now, we can see happening in some parts a very controversial thing that we won't get much into, but there's a lot of outcry about government policy recently related to use of renewable energy in some residential properties, which I can't get into, but for people interested, you can look into that. But you didn't hear from me. That concludes our episode for today. Dr. Shahana, thank you so much for your insight, for your your experience, all the things you said. That was great. If you have any other concluding comments, we'd be happy to hear them. But that was a great interview. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really glad to hear about Radio LUMS. I didn't know about it before. I think initiatives like this are great because not only does it promote students to get trained in, to get their voices heard, but it also is a great way to highlight issues of concern. So it's a great initiative and I'm so glad to be part of it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, this was Mustafa Khan with Providence. You were listening to Radio LUMS. Take care.